As we all know, there was a little process that Ronald Reagan had to go through to become President of the United States. It's known as an election. I spent a lot of time doing those things because one era of my life I was chairman of a board of elections. So, there were a lot of people who were very involved in it over the years, and we have one person who has been helping us with this program who was extremely involved. She worked for Bill Casey when he was a lawyer at Rogers and Wells, and when Bill became campaign chairman for, or director, or whatever the title was, for Ronald Reagan. She went to California and worked with him that intimately, and then she, later in her career, went back to a place down the street here at 16th and whatever, called 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House.
I wrote the code.
But break the code. But Barbara Hayward is going to chair this panel talking about the campaign. She was intimately involved in it. A lot of the details, I was up in New York trying to run a government, but she was a lot of the details. So Barbara, you go forward and you're going to introduce the speakers who are on this panel. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Owen, and thank you, Bernadette, for bringing me down and letting me help you with this. It's been a great honor, great honor. And I want to say thank you to everybody that came. This is such a fantastic day. And it's a day that Bill Casey incredibly deserves, because I think he's one of the unsung heroes of this whole 20th century. And I wish we could get him more and not less publicity. But I thought it'd be interesting for you to know how Bill Casey got involved in the campaign. I was working for him in New York up at Rogers and Wells, and he was very conservative, but he always thought I was a little too right-wing. So we had some very interesting discussions. And he said to me one day, when the primaries were going on, he said, Barbara, who are you going to vote for in this election? And I said, well, Ronald Reagan, of course. Who are you? And he said, I don't know. He said, I've given $1,000 to everybody, and I'm going to wait and see. And I said, but you've got to vote for Ronald Reagan. And he said, I don't know anything about him. And I said, he is fantastic, because I had been a Ronald Reagan fan since 1960. And so 2 days later, a little bit in the Wall Street Journal, Bill Casey's given $1,000 to everybody. And I'm thinking, how did they know that? I mean, he and I were just having this discussion. So anyway, a week later, Bill Casey gets a call from Mike Deaver. And Mike Deaver says, I would like to have you to come to meet Governor Reagan out in Long Island. I think it was, I can't remember the Holiday Inn, the Holiday Inn. And he said, Mr. Casey came out to my office and said, Barbara, Ronald Reagan, they want me to have breakfast with Ronald Reagan next week. And I said, my eyes sort of like popped out. And I said, oh, that's fantastic. And he said, what do you think I should do? I'm thinking about it later, I think he must have been teasing me, because I can't believe he was going to say no. But I'm like, you've got to go to have breakfast with him. And so he did, and he came back, and I said to him, well, what do you think? And he said to me, you know, he answered every question the way I wanted it to be answered. I'm going to support that man. And that was all to do with Ed Meese and Mike Deaver that got him involved. A week later, we got another call, and Governor Reagan then and Ed Meese and Mike Deaver came to the office and had another meeting with Mr. Casey. And then about 2 weeks later, during the New Hampshire primary, I get a call from Mr. Casey when I'm in the office, and I say, where are you? And he says, I'm on my way to New Hampshire. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm thinking I'm going to run the Reagan campaign. And I said, oh my God, this is so fantastic. So he decided that that's what he was going to do. And I've got to say that Mr. Casey had everything going for him at that time. Had a job he loved. He had a family he just enjoyed being with. He loved New York. He loved New York politics. But every time he felt the call, he never said no. He always, always answered the call. And he was just a great guy. So I get a call from him. I'm in the office, haven't seen him for like 2 or 3 weeks. And I get a call and he says, Barbara, I want you to meet me and Mr. Casey, Mrs. Casey at the station. We're going to go down to Washington on Sunday. So I said, okay. So I go meet them. We go down to Washington. We meet Drew Lewis, and we look at office space for the Reagan campaign coming down to Virginia on Columbia Pike. And we found office space, and about a week later, he said to me, you want to go down and work at the office down there and, and help with the campaign? And of course I said yes. And he was such an interesting, down-to-earth person, despite all of the honors bestowed upon him, because we would work from 7 o'clock in the morning, and he was still there at 7 o'clock at night, and we were all there. He'd round up everybody who was there and take them all out to dinner. Didn't matter whether they were a clerk, whether the office boy, didn't matter who it was. We would all go out to dinner. And it was just great. He was just great. And I have to say, Bernadette, your dad always found the best restaurants in town. Always found the best restaurants in town. So the next call I got, he said, would you like to go to the convention? Well, I have never been to a convention in my life. And I thought, this is going to be really, really neat. So I go to the convention, and one of the things that stood out in my mind, apart from the fact what an amazing thing it was, this to see my first convention and to see Ronald Reagan get nominated, I got a call. I was in the office, and Mr. Casey said to me, I'm having a meeting, and I want you to sit on the phone and make sure nobody gets through to me. And it was a meeting with the Casey people, including Ed, and Gerald Ford's people, because Gerald Ford wanted to be vice president. And they had decided that Gerald Ford had decided he wanted to be co-president. And he was going to take all of the foreign policy, and Ronald Reagan could take the rest. And I'm sitting at the phone, and I'm like, I can't believe this is happening. And I knew Mr. Casey would never agree to something like that, and he didn't. They all got up and they said, this is no deal, and they left. And as I go out of the room, I see Mrs. Casey getting off the elevator, and she is absolutely beside herself. And she said, Barbara, where is Bill? I've got to talk to him right away. And I said, well, I think he went to his room. And that was when I realized that behind every successful man, there's a strong woman, because she was going to give him a piece of her mind if he had agreed to this. So needless to say, he didn't agree to it, and we got George Ross Sr. And the rest is history. I truly believe that if it hadn't been for Mr. Casey and for Ed Meese and a few other really stalwarts in the Reagan campaign, we wouldn't have had a Reagan administration. I think the whole country changed because of Mr. Casey through Ronald Reagan. And I can only say Mr. Casey I've worked for some really, really interesting people. Mr. Casey was one of the best people, the best bosses, the most kind, the most impatient, the most demanding, that beneath it all would do anything for you. He changed my life. I mean, I would not be sitting here today. I would probably be still taking steno up in New York. But without him, he changed so many people's lives by getting Ronald Reagan elected, because we all went on a different road. And because of that, the country's different. And my only hope is that somewhere out there is another 21st century Ronald Reagan and Bill Casey waiting in the wings to save us from what is happening now. So I just want to say one last thing. I think Ronald Reagan and Bill Casey were giants in their time. They have huge footprints to follow, which is going to be very difficult for anybody. But I got to believe it's got to happen because our country needs it. Thank you. Oh, I beg your pardon. I have to introduce now Ambassador Jerry Carmen. Ambassador Carmen came to the campaign with with Bill Casey, great friends, and I would like to introduce him to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm pretty honored to be here. Actually, a kid from New Hampshire that Casey found and Ed Meese found at pretty good company. I think I would like you to understand, if those of you at my age will understand, but first I'll tell you how I met Bill Casey. In New Hampshire, we had a headquarters that was a private headquarters. It was not the public one on the main street. It was an old house that had been converted into lawyers' offices, and that's where we did the main part of the campaign. And in those days, if you remember, the campaign had not been going that well. Iowa was a loss. There was quite a lot of dissension in the Reagan campaign, and I know that Ed and the rest of them were really trying to hold the thing together and get by New Hampshire with a win if we could do it, and then move on. So I had made a decision as running the campaign that since there was such a disorientation and so much confusion, that I just wouldn't pay any attention to the campaign except to Ed Meese and people I was talking to, but not with the people that were running the campaign. And beside that, just for political background, you know, consultants generally like to travel with the boss in case he wins. So you get your brains in the planes and not on the ground lots of times, so it becomes a hardship trying to run a campaign. And while this was going on after Iowa, we were all doing our best we could in New Hampshire, and the office was sort of crowded, and I had my little office on the side, and one day I come out of the office, and by the way, I could work 18 hours a day, I think that's what Casey liked the best about me, but anyway, I come out of that office in a quick movement, and there's this old man sort of leaning against the wall. Now, when I say old man, it looks like he was 20 years younger than I am now, but that's how you look at somebody when you're 50. And he was just leaning against the wall, and I introduced myself, and he said, "I'm Bill Casey." And I said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "No, how's Reagan doing?" And I said, "Okay." I said, "We're working really hard. We're really very busy." I said, "If you can't help, don't hurt. Just don't get in the way." Well, 3 or 4 days later, I pick up the newspaper, and the campaign is considering him for chairman. If you want to see a career go down the tube in about 30 seconds, I couldn't believe it, you know? So anyway, New Hampshire went well, and we won. And somehow or other, I don't know how it happened, but what I attribute it to is, if you notice that everybody was talking today about the great things Bill did, but there was also a human factor through all these stories. There was a real Bill Casey that went through it all. And in fact, I was just thinking last night, which doesn't have a lot, I suppose, to the background of the campaign, but I was 11 years old when the Second World War started. My sister ran off to join the Marines. The country itself was so patriotic and so geared up to America first. I know that's not a term you use anymore, but that we do anything. The music that went, God Bless America and Home on a Prayer and everything, it was just such a patriotic era, an era in which every American thought we could do anything. We were the best country in the world, we could accomplish anything, and just go about the business of doing it. And that was the background, that was the real reason I was for Ronald Reagan. You could feel it, you could see it. You didn't get that Harvard and Yale stuff you get now. You know, President Reagan used to say C+ got you into athletics, and that pretty much was my background, so it worked all right with me. And Bill Casey was the same way. And many times when I hear these stories that you are, or we talk about the campaign, the main ingredient, the campaign between Casey and President Reagan, I believe, is they came from that background. That they just were great patriots. I mean, you weren't afraid to say patriot in those days. They were great patriots. And for those of us that were brought up in my generation, there's been a lot talked about the greatest generation. I think every generation is the greatest generation. But that generation was special, and Bill Casey was very special. And why he took a liking to me, I have no idea, except that I know how to work. I was a small tire dealer in New Hampshire. I went to University of New Hampshire, no great student, no great anything. And somehow, what people said today, you could talk to him and he would listen. If I told you how many nights I sat with him in that office in a campaign headquarters while your mother was downstairs in the car waiting for an hour or 2 hours while we talked about something. Another story during the campaign was that I had ideas, and Bill liked to listen to ideas. He's very receptive to things. I remember when we put I don't know if you remember, Bill, Ed, when we put, I think it was the women's care house to house. Avon, I think, had installed dishes, which were very new at the time in the Holiday Inn, so you could have meetings for their salespeople all around the country. You could put on a single meeting. And I remember we utilized the transmission capabilities there for the campaigns. But the relation went on and on. For whatever job or career I've had in government, I owe to Ed Meese and to Bill Casey both. I was a little, maybe a little like you, Barbara, a little far out even for him on the way I wanted. And of course, I believe to this day, I love politics. All the jobs that the administration gave me were to compensate for not giving me the one I wanted. I wanted the RNC, and I kind of screwed up. And by the way, I screwed that up because I didn't take Bill Casey's advice. So he was a great teacher and a great mentor. But the ability that he brought, this overall Americanism, if you want to call it, to the campaign, and the unifying factor that he brought to our campaign that was really completely disordered at the time. And Ed was pretty kind about the event that went on at the airport. I happened to be there. It didn't go quite that way at the start, but the president and Casey calmed everybody down, and Ed, and I think Paul Laxalt was there, if I remember right. That was really an insurgent group. They had met the night before and decided that Casey was not going to be the campaign manager, but that one of them would be. And unfortunately, when they came down and they were faced to looking at the boss and looking at Ed, looking at Casey, looking at the Laxalt, people were there at the head table. The spokesman who was going to lead the revolution, I don't know if you remember or not, got up and said what they had planned to say at the start of it, except nobody supported him from his own group. It was over. And of course, the president brought it back together again, and we went on from there. As far as I was concerned, he sent me to Massachusetts, and he sent me to Florida. Then he gave me a special assignment in the Folger building here next to the Treasury Department to try to bring some of the young people together. And then they sent me over to the RNC, which I thought I did a good job, but as it turned out, I went one step too far and got kind of thrown out. But anyhow, but he always took care of me every step of the way. And lastly, it's hard to tell you people. You're all from Washington, and I suppose I am too. But when you start in a campaign, at least in New Hampshire, you don't know about jobs and you don't want jobs. You really, your heart and soul is in the candidate you're trying to elect. And if you're lucky enough to come down here and you start getting calls about plum books and jobs and things like that, you really didn't even know what they're talking about. Maybe I was naive, maybe I was new, I don't know what it was. I thought I was a lot smarter than I turned out to be. They taught me a lot down here. But anyway, I had a small office in the old executive office building. I thought I had died and gone to heaven because my father never finished high school, and his parents were immigrants, and here I was in the White House with my flag outside it. I mean, who could ask for anything else? Casey said to me, "What do you want?" I had never even thought about it, Ed. You know, it just wasn't part of our campaign. And I said I like politics. He said, go see Lynn Knopfsinger. I don't know if Laura's still here, but I went to see him, and he had somebody else picked called Ed Rollins. Ed Rollins from California. I went back and told Ed, and I went back and told Casey, and Casey said to me an interesting thing. Shows you how well he knows the people he's working with and the people that he's guiding. And Ed would tell you, I wasn't the easiest guy to control. So Casey says to me, get your own shop. I remember the language, get your own shop. I don't even know what he meant. I didn't even know what he meant by that. But he said, but there's 4 or 5 good jobs in the White House. You can't have any of those. You'd be working for somebody else with those jobs. Get your own shop. And of course, the end of that story was the president asked me to run GSA. So what I would like to convey mostly about Bill was really what a great guy he was. Not the things he did, but really what a great person, what a great mentor, what a great human being. And that it all comes about, I think, by the family, who he was and who he came from. And that's sort of the story of Ronald Reagan. So it went together pretty well.
I never thought you were a hard guy to control.
Hey, I could tell the story about the first time I met you.
I remember you.
I just want to say, Jerry Coleman told me something when we were talking about this. That when that President Reagan selected Bush, and the Bush people all moved into the office, and I think Jerry said to Bill Casey, you know, what is this? You know, why are we being so nice to them? And Bill Casey said, you want to win, don't you?
Well,
So
if I could just add to that, we were in the building, I think in Arlington. Is that where
Yeah,
it
at
was?
Columbia Pike.
And
yeah.
I was still carrying the wounds from primary, and primary was really over, but we haven't had the convention yet. And I'm working with Bill, and all of a sudden David Rockefeller goes by. And then Ann Armstrong, because these probably don't mean anything to people. Ann Armstrong goes by. Kissinger goes by. Of course, Jim Baker came in and became finance or whatever it was in charge. So we had all these different people coming in that we just beaten. And in New Hampshire, we don't do that. So I went to Casey and I said, what's going on? And he said, you want to win, don't you? And I said, yes. He said, well, you got to make those circles larger and larger. I'll always remember that. You got to make those circles larger and larger. And of course, he was right.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jerry. Our next speaker is going to be Richard Allen. He was National Security Advisor on the campaign and also National Security Advisor, National Security Advisor to Ronald Reagan in the White House. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, Dick.
Well, thank you, Barbara. It's a pleasure to be with you and be with Ed and be with his everlasting worship, Pastor Carmen. What was that first time we met, by the way? Never mind. Never mind.
Okay.
I have to confess that I am a Caseyite from much earlier on, and it has to do with a 1968 campaign of Richard Nixon. We were in Key Biscayne, Florida, and Mr. Nixon was waxing enthusiastic and angrily about newspaper people not writing about what he was talking about. And they accused him of not speaking to the issues. And so out on Bebe Rebozo's lawn, Bebe was Mr. Nixon's close friend, on Bebe Rebozo's lawn, there were several tables. Martin Anderson and I were sitting at one of the tables, and Annalise Anderson, Martin's wife, Martin handling the domestic affairs of the Nixon campaign, and I the foreign policy and national security aspects. And Mr. Nixon got really angry, and he slapped the table and he said, "Damn it, Anderson and Allen, I want you to get your asses up to New York now, tonight, and begin compiling all of my positions on the issues, because we don't want to hear anymore about this not speaking to the issues. So yes, sir, we left, got on the plane, went north. He didn't tell us about Bill Casey. So along about the second day, we were working day and night, putting together the campaign positions, which both Marty Anderson and Annalise Anderson and I had, the domestic side, and I had the foreign policy side, and we were putting together in a book. And lo and behold, there appeared in my doorframe this big, hulking fellow saying, "How's it going?" Well, I didn't have any idea who he was, and I said, "It's going fine with me. How's it going with you?" He said, "Don't give me that crap. You know what I mean." Well, I didn't know what he meant, but he had been sent up by Mr. Nixon to ride herd on the pups to see that we got the job done. We published a 220-page book in 4 days and 4 nights and delivered copies to the campaign in Boston, Massachusetts, and that put an end to Mr. Nixon never again hearing the issues, that he was not speaking to the issues. I stayed in touch with Bill all through his time in Washington, and then during the Republican policy days in the Republican National Committee, Marty and I tried gradually to take control of the policy departments, the policy areas of what would appear to be the preparations for another campaign, study groups. And we did, by and large. By then, we were working with California headquarters, and by the time we got to 1979 and 80, there had begun to take shape a very comprehensive domestic and international platform reflecting, above all, Ronald Reagan's thinking and wishes. We shouldn't forget that Governor Reagan gave a daily radio speech of about 3.5 minutes for almost 4 years, from 1976 on through 1979. All of these have been published and compiled by Marty and Annalise Anderson, and they're yours to read. There was a topic about every single matter under the sun, domestic and foreign. You can even listen to these in drive time radio if you buy the DVDs. So what there was essentially an articulated foreign policy and domestic policy platform already in formation, because it did reflect Governor Reagan's inner desires and his own feelings toward policy. Those things blended into what became a very comprehensive platform that, with the aid of Dick Wirthlin, Richard Wirthlin, the president's chief strategist and pollster, became this little book, the Republican Platform of 1980, which had 5 subtitles: family, neighborhood, work, peace, and freedom. Keeping it that simple, we worked every campaign theme and every sub-speech from these major 5 themes, of course staying consistent, and the main element of consistency was not only Bill Casey making sure that we stayed consistent, and Ed Meese, but Ronald Reagan himself. He rarely, as Ed will tell you, rarely spoke a word that he didn't agree with, and he would change it, or say, "Why did you write it that way?" and rewrite it in his own way. So going into that 1980 campaign, there was a comprehensive worldview that was formulated and could be read. Family, neighborhood, work, peace, and freedom. These were marvelous, simple concepts, and they were concepts which the average human being could understand. It accounted in large measure, in my view, for the appeal of Ronald Reagan. When I had approached Governor Reagan back in early 1978 to ask him if he would do a favor for me, there ensued a long, long discussion of about 5 or 6 hours in his house. And at the end of that discussion, he said to me, "Before you leave, there's something I'd like to tell you, I'd like to share with you." And I said, yes, sir, what is that? And he said, well, I'd like to tell you my theory of the Cold War. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, my theory of the Cold War is we win and they lose. What do you think about that? Well, I thought that was a pretty slick idea. It was what I had been fighting for and writing books about and articles all of my life. And it certainly represented what most every other red-blooded American felt and wished. And there it was. We win and they lose. And by that, as Peter Schweitzer will attest, he did not mean humiliation, defeat, destruction, physical destruction of any type. He meant that there would be a clear winner in the race and a clear loser. And I think that as much as any other aspect of putting America in order, Ronald Reagan's crusade to win the Cold War in the most distinguished of ways, if you will, even the most polite way, was at the centerpiece of all that he thought. That and putting America back to work again. Bill was absolutely instrumental in that. He was instrumental in Bill Casey in 1968, and in the work that we did in the intervening years, he was instrumental, and he came to the fore, came into his own in a really critical and important way by 1979 and 80. It was amazing to watch him seamlessly integrate his own thinking with that of Ronald Reagan, because there wasn't anything new on either side. Both thought the same thing. There was a question of tactics, of course. And we did have a campaign structure. It was called a John Sears campaign. And there were two other fellows working with John Sears, and push came to shove, and the decision had to be taken to relieve John Sears of his duties and bring in Bill Casey. I brought with me, but I won't bother to regale you with, the minute-by-minute happenings of 2 weeks between 14th of February 1980 and the 26th of February, the day of the New Hampshire primary. The many things transpired during those 2 weeks, and the result was that at 5 o'clock in the afternoon of primary day, Sears and Charlie Black and Jim Lake were gone, and Bill Casey was in, and we had a new ball game entirely, to the great consternation of the nation's press traveling with Governor Reagan in New Hampshire, wondering, who in the hell is this guy, Bill Casey? Meanwhile, Pete Hannaford took over the interim press duty job until Ed Gray could be brought in from California and to take on the reins himself. So there were decisions that had to be made in the name of salvation of the campaign. Without those decisions, Reagan wouldn't have won. And without General Bill Casey running the show in conjunction with Ed Meese and a number of our other colleagues, especially those on the ground in New Hampshire, I credit you, Ambassador Carmen, for that. Putting together the machinery made it work. When the campaign left New Hampshire, we went to South Carolina, and there wasn't enough money to charter an airplane, a small airplane, a 5-passenger airplane, to charter the airplane to get over to Atlanta, Georgia to do some media events. And I don't know how we cobbled together the money to get enough money to fly a Learjet to Atlanta and back with 2 Secret Service guys and a few other of us on the plane, but it all started there. And the money began to come in, and it began to turn. The entire cast of history, if you will, or the tide of history, began to turn. And from then on, I believe, and in my own recollection, it was juggernaut all the way to the end. And then, of course, by acclamation in the campaign, a win, and then the opportunity to implement that which he had fought so hard for, and that was to win, to put America back to work again, to restore pride, to retrieve our hostages and the honor that went with them when they were taken by the Iranians, to demonstrate to the USSR that we meant business, as indeed in the first press conference, President Reagan said, "Of course we know the Soviets will lie, cheat, and steal to get whatever they want," which caused almost a collective coronary on the part of 300 press in the West Wing of the White House. But it worked, and it stuck. He had a strategy, he decided to implement it, and he won. And that was my story, to be with him, and it was a great pleasure and honor all the time, especially to be with Bill and to Governor Reagan and the rest of the great crowd that we had running the campaign.
Our next speaker doesn't need me to introduce him because I think he's already been introduced today. So I'm just going to say to the person who is carrying on the Reagan legacy for all of us, and Ed Meese is a terrific guy, a terrific representative of all Ronald Reagan stood for, and a good friend of Bill Casey. So Ed, it's your turn.
Thank you. It's great to be back here with my colleagues and to kind of relive those days of particularly New Hampshire. One thing I just like to remind people, or for those who weren't there in 1980, explain to them, everybody thinks now, gosh, Ronald Reagan must have had an easy time running for president, because in retrospect, it looked easy. He won by a substantial margin, an amazing margin in many ways, because there were 3 candidates ultimately in the final, and he still won with a majority of the votes. The campaign was a tough primary campaign. We had many luminaries representing essentially the Eastern Republican establishment who were running, and you had Ronald Reagan. You had, for example, George H.W. Bush, who had been chairman of the Republican Party, ambassador to China, director of Central Intelligence. You had Howard Baker, who was at that time the Republican leader in the Senate. You had Phil Crane, who was one of the bright young leaders in the House. You had, I think Bob Dole was one of the candidates at the time. You had John Connally, the former governor of Texas, who had become a Republican. So you had, and you had John Anderson, who ultimately had an independent campaign for the presidency when he did not win the primary. So this was going into the primary season, and particularly in New Hampshire. George I, as I think of him, George H.W. Bush, had won the Iowa caucuses. The campaign director at that time decided on his own, effectively, that Ronald Reagan was going to act like he already had the nomination in the bag. As Lynn Nofziger, who was then our press secretary, said, John's idea is to have a rose garden strategy. Unfortunately, he doesn't have a rose garden. And so really, it was not only a strategic problem, but it was a problem in actual delegates and whether we were going to prevail. And so that, plus the turmoil that was internal turmoil caused largely by the then campaign professional leadership, was really New Hampshire was really a make or break situation, as Jerry mentioned and Dick referred to. So this was very important. What Dick mentioned about what they had done in the Nixon campaign in 1968, that was what was related to me by Dick and by Marty. And again, that was the explanation that Bill Casey had made at that meeting that I talked about earlier in my remarks today. And it was that process that he was involved in, which was particularly something that we felt we could use, and that was the kind of the entree that got him involved. And it was, again, fortunately, he was there when this blow-up occurred, and he was a person who had many attributes, not only his own experience, his own position and stature as a leader, but also the fact that he was from outside. So it wasn't like choosing among the people who had already been in the campaign. So his presence there, as Dick says, was a very crucial part of having the events of February come out right. And one of the things was, I think, again, it showed Ronald Reagan's own ideas, he had a dilemma. The weekend before, where considerable consideration had been given to the change and the reorganization of the campaign, Dick was very much involved in that, both by phone and then in person, as I remember, in this hotel. And it wasn't a hotel in New Hampshire. It was a hotel in Andover, just across the line. Because in those days, you were limited on how much you could pay, how much you could spend in each state. And since we didn't care much about Massachusetts, that was not a significant player as far as we were concerned in the primary, but New Hampshire was crucial, so we all stayed in Andover and then crossed the line into New Hampshire, Worcester. And we then crossed over into New Hampshire during the day to campaign, and then back to the lodging, the bivouac in Massachusetts. So this was really a very crucial time, and as Dick has already related the events of that 2-week period. There are a few things I think would be interesting to think about in regard to Bill Casey and his generalship, if you will, during that period. One was he was very good at setting procedures and rules for the campaign. Not a lot of them, but those that were critical. And one, of course, was that there should be absolutely nobody thinking about what they might do or what job they might get. Jerry kind of referred to that. Nobody was thinking about what job they would get in the White House, because the whole emphasis was to focus on the campaign itself. And after we win the campaign, if we do, then you can think about what you might want to do later on. But during the campaigns itself, there was a total focus on winning the campaign, which was very important. Another thing was the efforts that were made to integrate policy with campaign process. And that was why the ideas that Dick has been talking about that started developing long before the actual campaign in 1978, many of the ideas had actually been generated in the 1976 campaign and then were updated for the 1980 campaign. And again, Bill's guidance on that was very important, and the work that Dick and Marty Anderson particularly did in those days was particularly important. One of the things, for example, that Dick personally did was one of the potential vulnerabilities of Ronald Reagan as a candidate was foreign policy, because he'd been a governor. And so Dick arranged a trip, for example, to take Ronald Reagan over through Europe, meeting with heads of state and others, and also elsewhere, to deal with that particular problem. One of the things that Bill Casey also did, as I think one of you mentioned, a lot of times the professional campaign managers all want to be on the plane standing right next to the candidate, showing everybody how smart they are. Bill didn't do that. Bill stayed at headquarters where he could run the whole operation and where he could provide the guidance. Obviously, we were in contact with the plane. As a matter of fact, I think we were the first campaign to set up a watch station there with 24-hour contact with the plane in case something should happen. There were a lot of things going on. We had the hostages over in Iran at the time. Bill thought up this great idea. Everybody was concerned that Jimmy Carter, having all the power of the presidency, would pull some slick tactic in October to all of a sudden get the prisoners released so that they would come home, or some other significant thing on the eve of the election itself, so that they would have sudden momentum and sudden attention to something that Jimmy Carter had done right, and that this then would give them the momentum to get over the finish line for the election. So Bill thought up this idea of starting to talk to the press as early as the beginning of October or the end of September about an October surprise, and without making a big deal about it, but just in casual conversation with the press, we got to be careful of what Carter might do to create an October surprise. So October surprise became a word of art that people were talking about. So in a sense, we had inoculated the press so that if in fact Carter did something like that, they would be prepared to see it for what it was. But this was the kind of strategic thinking that Bill did. Also, one of the things that he was able to do that I think was impressive for a campaign leader, and that was to take the ideas, the policy ideas of Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan didn't start, even in 1976, start thinking about major national policy issues. He'd been thinking about this ever since the 1940s. on Israel, for example, where he had been a champion of Israel when it was first created, on many issues such as dealing with the communists. He had dealt with the communists as the president of the Screen Actors Guild in the 1940s when they tried to take over the movie industry and use it for propaganda. And he had read greatly, just like Bill Casey. Now, I will not try to pretend that Ronald Reagan read as much as Bill Casey, because I don't know that any human being has. But Ronald Reagan did read a lot about things he was interested in. And as a result, he had a friend who was an expert on the Soviet Union, and he had written some books on this, and Ronald Reagan was very well versed in several things. One is the founding and the founding principles. A second was conservative doctrine, and the third was communism, both domestically and internationally. And so he had these ideas pretty well fixed in his mind from a strategic standpoint, and Bill Casey didn't try to change his ideas as the predecessor campaign manager had tried to do. One of the great problems with the previous campaign management that ran from 1979 up until February of 1980 was he was trying to remake Ronald Reagan in the image of the Republican establishment in the East, and particularly cater to the news media of what they thought Ronald Reagan ought to stand for.
Didn't work.
And it didn't work, obviously, but also it was the wrong thing to do. You can't take a person's deeply thought out ideas and then try and transform them artificially to contend with what somebody thinks the Eastern establishment might want or that the press might want. As a matter of fact, that would have been a sure loser if they had been able to do that. And so that was why Bill supporting and enhancing and in a sense, making sure that the campaign followed Ronald Reagan's ideas so that that was the prevailing policy comprehensive program that everybody in the campaign was following at that time. I would like to say one thing about the point that Jerry made and Bill's easy support of this idea of bringing in people from the campaigns of those who had been defeated in the primaries. Ronald Reagan started that in 1966 when he was running for governor of California and won. He had had a tough primary campaign there against George Christopher, who was the mayor of San Francisco, who was his opponent in the primaries for governor. Now, it may startle you to think that there was a Republican governor in San Francisco any time in that century, but there was. And what Ronald Reagan did, he had left several top spots in his campaign organization till after the primary was decided, and then brought his opponent's top people into his campaign, thus unifying the party in California. And that was the reason, as Jerry has indicated here, which Bill supported and actually had the same ideas himself, was the way in which you unify the Republican Party going into the fall was to bring these other people. So we got some very good people from George H.W. Bush. We got people like Jim Brady and others from John Connolly's campaign and others who had been serving other candidates. So in effect, Ronald Reagan did everything he could to have a unified campaign going into the fall period. And that was a very important part. The final thing I want to say is the campaign, the convention that year, as you know, was in Detroit. And that was in itself people were somewhat apprehensive. The slogan in California was that the Detroit had been selected as the convention location. There was good news and bad news for the California delegation. The good news was that the delegation from California was headquartered hotel was only 5 minutes away from the convention center. The bad news was nobody had ever made it. But fortunately, that didn't prove to be true, and we actually had a very good convention there. And I think due to, again, Bill Casey's campaign leadership, Ronald Reagan's personality and approach to the thing, we did have a unified party coming out of the convention, as a result of which we had a successful campaign period, and you all know the result. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you to Ed and to Dick and to excuse me, Ambassador Carmen. Thank you, Jerry. And I just got one more thing to say. I think Mr. Casey was a Renaissance man. is a 20th century Renaissance man. I don't know anything that he couldn't do, except maybe cook breakfast. I don't know about that. But he was so far ahead of his time in many ways. But one thing that struck me with Bill Casey was he didn't have a prejudiced bone in his body. He didn't care what color you were. He didn't care what gender you were. He didn't care what age you were. If you could do the job, he wanted you there. And my two memories of him is saying to me about Ray Buchanan, this woman is going to go places, and look at where she is now. And he said, Mary Jane Wick, if she ever went into business, I would support her. I'd give her my money. So he's a great supporter of anyone who he thought could do the job. And I wish we had more like him. And I wish that the Republican Party today and the Republican Congress today would take a leaf out of Bill Casey's and Ronald Reagan's book and work together and become a unified party and let us win.
The next panel is going to address a favorite topic of mine. During the beginning of the Reagan administration, we had something called the Cold War. We no longer have the Cold War. A lot of people will have you believe that just happened. It didn't just happen. It was planned. The whole national security policy of the Reagan administration was to make sure that that would happen. And as we all know, it was successful, and there is no Cold War. This afternoon's panel is going to look at how that came about, and is going to talk about the steps that were taken to ensure that would happen. On the panel we have, and I got to figure out if I have everybody here, I hope I do, Dr. John Linchowski, who we've heard from earlier. He's the president of the Institute of World Politics. Mr. Joe Detrani. Joe Detrani was a very important part of the agency activities. Somewhere around here, I'm not going to read it though, I have his bio, but I'm not going to get into that. I have not done that yet. But in addition to serving a stint as Special Assistant, Executive Assistant to the DCI, Bill Casey, he was sent to China. And today he's probably one of the most knowledgeable people about our relationships with China. He has recently left service and is president of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance. He's teaching, and he's a great expert, particularly on our relationships with China. We have Peter Schweitzer. I see him over there somewhere. Many of you have seen some of his books. He wrote a book called Victory. I think I heard a story, correct me if I'm wrong, you know I've never talked about this, that you got your degrees and so on, and you were a specialist in Soviet studies, and you realized, what happened to Soviet? Yeah. So he wrote a book about it, and he documented the fact that an awful lot of it was the result of our planning to make sure that happened. We have General Ed Rowney, who was Chief of Strategy in Arms Negotiation during the Reagan administration. We have Henry Now, who was Director of International Economic Affairs in the National Security Council. Did I get everybody? Okay. So have you guys decided among yourselves who wants to start?
Joe, why don't you
Do you want to start?
start, Joe?
2 minutes?
Okay,
let
Joe?
me just- thank you,
Okay,
Owen.
Joe. Thank you.
Just a few minutes. Thank you, Owen. Bernadette, thank you. It's really an honor being here this morning. Some of the great presentations talking about such a great man. It gives one energy and gives one hope, and it's exciting. It's exciting hearing all of you. I came by meeting Director Casey a little different than most of you. I was overseas. I was an intelligence officer coming back from overseas. Bob Gates suggested I go and meet with the new director. I just got back from overseas, Director Casey, And they were looking for an executive assistant. I really said, you know, I'm an overseas officer. And I sat down with Bill Casey, and I tell you, there was only one person I wanted to work for. And I'm being very honest here. Anybody who knows me knows I kind of shoot straight that way. This was a gracious man. I never met the man before. I never saw a picture of the man before. I just got back. And Bob said, go in and meet him. And very gracious, sat down, went in his office. He's a big man. I looked at his desk, and it was a mess. The impression was, my God, he must be inundated with all the work here. And again, this is a new agency, and doesn't have the background and what have you, but he was gracious. He spent the time, and he said, come join the team. And
Joe, everybody talks about his desk being a mess, but can you imagine the job Betty Murphy had in clearing it off and putting it all back in the safe every night?
Betty Murphy was a safe. She was just great. But I tell you, though, Goen, although the desk was he knew every piece of paper on that desk. And all those books that were stacked up, he had read those books. And I got to know that because I was the executive assistant. I would get in there before he got in the office, and he got in very early at 7, so it's a long day. And he left very late, about 7:30, 8 o'clock at night, so it's a long day. And that material on that desk, he read. He was intimate with the work of the Central Intelligence Agency and the whole intelligence community. He knew the people. He knew the authors. He was in touch with the national intelligence officers. He would bring them in. And his sense was, this is such a great organization, such a great community. You need to be out there. And he brought vigor. He brought energy and enthusiasm. Mind you, at that period of time, we were sort of on a lull. We went through a bad patch. And this man came back, and he was close to the president. He had a vision, and he knew the work from his OSS days. So some of my initial impressions were, well, he's dealing with a lot of sophisticated officers who were overseas officers. He's very sophisticated, but he doesn't have that intimate overseas, so maybe he could be, we could spin things, and maybe, he'd be susceptible. On the contrary, he was on top of his play. He knew the business from his OSS days. He engendered great respect from the operators, the analysts, and the operators. Those are case officers who worked overseas to collect it, and those analysts who put it together. He had great respect for them, and he would meet with them, and we inculcate with them that you got to be enthusiastic about it. Some impressions. I read everything. He was an avid reader, as everyone, Judge Sporkin and everyone said. He was a voracious appetite. He was a great writer. So he had his own speechwriter. We had people who would prepare him for cabinet meetings. And it was great working with these people because they did a lot of work, and when we'd get it, he'd look at it, and he'd change everything. And they, oh my goodness. And he's getting in the elevator to go and meet with the president, and he's changing it. And he's sending it back to the author and saying, you really didn't express it the way I wanted it. A lot of frustration there, but it spoke to his perfectionism. He wanted each word proper. He wanted to convey the message in a meaningful way. But people enjoyed that because it gave them that much more of a challenge to meet his expectations, which were extremely, extremely high. We heard a little about he was articulate. He wrote well, but he also spoke extremely well. Now, if he was on Congress and he didn't like the questions, he'd mumble. And that's a strategy. It's not a bad one. I've learned that afterwards also. I think many of us, you don't like that. But he conveyed it. He was very powerful. He brought a sense of management to the intelligence community, and certainly the CIA. I remember him giving a book out, In Search of Excellence, to each of the senior managers, and having a meeting and talking about it. Let's go into the management. Are we managing well? Are we managing our people well? Are we mentoring? We only have a short period of time. He was anxious. He was impatient. He was very impatient. You remind me a lot when you think about China, because that's a little of my background. Deng Xiaoping was impatient when he came in 1979. You got to go forward. Bill Casey was impatient. And what was he impatient for? The defeat of communism. His vision, working with the president, the vision. Defeat communism wherever it is. If it's in Afghanistan, he did it in Afghanistan. How did he do it in Afghanistan? He brought a coalition of the willing. He worked with the Saudi Arabians. He worked with China. We were able in China to get material into the Mujahideen and so forth. And the Soviets were defeated. They had their best forces, the Sputniks. And I remember some of the analysts who put out papers in the beginning of that saying, there's no way the Soviets could be defeated in Afghanistan. With the power they have in there, they were defeated. And Bill Casey was the architect of that. And he worked that, and he worked it hard, and he did it quietly. And that's where all the pieces came together. SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. His point was you could bankrupt the Soviet Union. Let them think we have capabilities with all their strategic forces, whether it's 9,000 nuclear warheads and ICBMs that can reach us, we will have a shield. And that's when the president spoke about Star Wars, SDI, and so forth. That was Casey's view. Get it out there, because eventually the Soviets are going to spend every penny they have trying to defeat our capabilities, our countermeasures, and so forth. And we saw that happening. We saw that coming into play. Get information into the people in Eastern Europe, into the Soviet Union, because truth is powerful. You don't have to manipulate anything. Just get the truth in there. Let the people realize how rogue those regimes are and so forth. And we saw that happening. Interesting for me, because when I came back, I worked for Bill Casey for almost 3 years. Then I went overseas, and I came back and I worked for him again. And a lot of that was getting information out. And it was very, very powerful. Unfortunately, he passed away. But 2 years after he had passed, I remember in Beijing with the Tiananmen incident. In Beijing at the Tiananmen incident, we also had the visit of Gorbachev, if you remember that. The Chinese didn't meet him. They had the ceremony at the airport, not the Great Hall of the People, because of the demonstrations at Tiananmen. And you will see this in Kissinger's book. Kissinger was mentioned this morning in the book. Gorbachev came to Beijing at that time for what? They wanted a loan from China. They wanted money from China. Could you imagine this? How bankrupt they were. Bankrupt not only in a material sense, but bankrupt intellectually and morally. Because 2 years after that, there was the whole demise of the Soviet Empire. It came down. And that, I think, Peter, you captured that so well. This is the legacy of Bill Casey. This is the Bill Casey I knew, who brought energy to an agency, who inculcated a spirit there, who got people out meeting there, having them produce the highest levels, having high expectations and having them go for it and so forth. But having a vision and being patient with it and moving forward, and then recognizing excellence. Because it was said by many people here, whether you were his driver, whether you was his executive assistant, or whether you were the president on the cabinet, he treated people that way. This was a man you wanted to be with, a very gracious man, a man who indeed, just by his nature, was a leader. And I can tell you this was a great experience for me, and John Helgeson spoke a little this afternoon. He's doing some work on that, an agency colleague of mine. I think Bill Casey will go down as one of our greatest directors of Central Intelligence, but one of our greatest Americans. So it's been an honor invited here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add to that? I'm going to add a quick story to that. You know, the United States were great supporters of solidarity. And I remember one time this is a Casey story, I got a phone call from Bill Casey. And he said, you know the people in London that make mimeograph machines? And I did have some contact with them, so I knew who they were. He said, get 50 that don't require electricity. Get 50 hand ones. And we'll let you know where they're supposed to go. And at a luncheon about 2 or 3 years ago at the Institute of World Politics, I told that story to La Coenza. Yes, that was Solidarity's newspaper. That's how Solidarity published their newspaper. They got to Poland. He picked them up outside of Warsaw, and they used them for the newspaper. Who wants to go next? Peter? Okay.
Well, I'm a little bit handicapped on this panel because everyone here played a role in the Reagan administration and had contact with Bill Casey. I was actually a college student in the 1980s. Had Henry Now as a professor, and then went off to Oxford University, where I did my master's thesis, completed in 1990, on the future of the Soviet military. 6 months later, the Soviet Union fell apart, so the timing wasn't all that great. But that did get me interested in this question of exactly what Owen said, and that is, how did this happen? And I don't really have personal stories to tell in the context that others do, but let me just make sort of two broad comments that I think are vital on this. The first one is looking at the paper trail. And by that I mean that very much from the Reagan administration has been declassified now. And you can actually go through and look at those documents. And when you put them in the context of American foreign policy since the beginning of the Cold War.
Can I interrupt you for just a second?
Sure.
The disc in the back of your handout that you received when you registered, the disc contains all of those documents.
Fantastic.
And the one note that I was told I have to tell you is, for some reason, you have to double-click it. Now, I'm not quite sure what that means, but there's probably some people who know more about computers than I do who realize what that means, but you have to double-click it to get into it.
And those documents are so interesting because you have things like National Security Decision Directives, NSDDs, which were the sort of the top secret strategy documents that I'm sure people at this panel actually were involved in writing. But if you look at, say, for example, NSDD 32, which was sort of the grand strategy or global strategy of the Reagan administration, it talks about the fact that we need to have an offensive strategy, that we need to look for opportunities and ways to roll back Soviet power. That was a pretty revolutionary idea in foreign policy, to actually embrace that idea and then develop some ways in which they could do that. Or if you look at, I think it's NSDD 53, which was on Eastern Europe, the same thing. It was not talking about accepting Soviet dominion over Eastern Europe. It was saying we need to look for opportunities to pull these countries out of the Soviet orbit. Or NSDD 75, which was on Soviet foreign policy, which talked about the fact that they had economic vulnerabilities and we needed to look for ways to exploit those vulnerabilities to our advantage. Certainly, the panel here can talk about some of the ways in which that was carried out. But that was the strategy that was laid out, and Bill Casey was a central component of that. You had the Reagan Doctrine, which was really a brilliant idea in that it said we're going to, instead of sending the military everywhere, we're going to arm local individuals who are tired of Soviet rule and who want to resist Soviet power. And this was a strategy, by the way, that drove the Soviets nuts. Because if you look in the Soviet archives, what you find is a lot of complaints about the fact that this is a sort of go-cheap strategy by the United States. You know, the Soviet military is pouring all this aid into Africa and Latin America and into Afghanistan, and the Americans are pouring in maybe 10 to 15% of what we do, and they're still winning. So there's a very, very clear central role that Bill Casey played in the Reagan Doctrine and also on the economic side, which is saying we're going to fight the Cold War in a different way. We're not going to play to the Soviet strengths, which is to mass produce things like tanks. We're going to go and we're going to exploit their weaknesses, which is in the realm of economics and in the realm of high technology, their inability to match us when it comes to military technology. The second thing I want to emphasize and mention is that there's also a fair amount of material that's come out from the East German Stasi and from the Soviet archives. Those have been closed now, but there is information available. And what's fascinating about this, and I think is completely forgotten, unfortunately, in a lot of the discussions that people have about the end of the Cold War, is the central role that what Bill Casey and the Reagan administration was doing, the central role that that played in the rise to power of Mikhail Gorbachev. The sense that some people have is that what the Kremlin did in picking Gorbachev, it just sort of happened in isolation. It was his turn. They'd had a bunch of these old leaders, Andropov and Chernenko, who had died, so they picked this young guy, Gorbachev. If you actually look at the minutes of the Politburo as that selection process took place, two things stand out. Number one, they were frustrated as all get out with what the Reagan administration was doing. They talk about the fact that, we extend an olive branch in terms of some peace initiative, and they basically ignore it and keep building up their military and keep advancing in these areas. The second thing that comes out in those discussions is their view that the only way that they were going to be able to compete with the United States under Ronald Reagan was to move towards radical reform. And by that I mean not that everyone was aboard, but the KGB, the foreign ministry, even elements of the military in these meetings talk about the fact that Gorbachev in a reform agenda has to be done because otherwise we're doomed. We're going to be left behind the United States. So I think it's very important when you discuss with people about how the Cold War ended and the role that Gorbachev played in that. I think there's very, very clear evidence that Ronald Reagan and Bill Casey made Gorbachev possible. That if the United States had adopted a détente policy, as had been done by Jimmy Carter and others, there would not have been this external pressure on the Soviet system. They would not have felt the need to reform. So, in short, I'm going to cede this to the individuals here who were participants, but certainly I think that there is lots of evidence, powerful evidence, that Bill Casey played a vital role in bringing about the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was not something that happened in isolation, but it's something that happened as a result of external pressure that pushed the Soviet Union over the brink. And with that, I'll turn it over to the rest of the panel.
General Rowney was the chief strategic arms negotiator during the Reagan administration, and maybe he would like to add to the what we've had to date. General?
Thank you. I remember when Casey and Ed Meese and a few other people were working with Ed Fuller during the campaign on the playbook. And they were working on the first 100 days. What will we do? We're going to win, and when we win, what will we do? Well, when I became the chief negotiator, I had the privilege of sitting in on the cabinet meetings, and there was one member there who had been in that formation, and when Reagan got to a point, he'd say, well, we've done that now. What's the next point, Bill, in the playbook? So all the other cabinet members were stunned, but Casey would tell them, well, this is what we do next, Mr. President. Another thing I remember is that we're sitting around one day, and all the cabinet members are complaining. Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, the Secretary of Human Services, Arms Control Agency, all saying, Mr. President, you just can't go along with this peace through strength policy. You can't spend this kind of money for defense. You have double-digit inflation. You have double-digit unemployment. And at this point, Casey is shaking his head no. And Reagan said, gentlemen, he said, I'm the President of the United States, and my mission, my charge is to provide for the security of the United States, and that security of the United States requires that we have enough strength, because if you want to have strength, you want to have peace, si vis pacem para bellum. He didn't say that, but I remember the old saying, if you want to have peace, it goes through strength. So I remember that Casey was a great player there. Casey had great rapport with Reagan, and I found that on another occasion. I was in the White House when Ed Rollins came in, said, Mr. President, we've decided so-and-so was going to get such and such a job. And he said, okay, Mr. President. And he said, well, I don't know. Have you checked it out with Casey? And I said, no. He said, check it out with Casey. If Casey says okay, he's in. If he doesn't, he's out. So he had very good power. I knew that again when I had a partner. We were both ambassador rank and both special advisors to the president, and he was Paul Nitzian, a very distinguished, dignified guy, and a fair-haired boy of the Secretary of State, which I was not. Nitzian was a little left of center, and I was a little right of center. Well, when we got into a knockdown drag-out on where to go, and I wanted to win, I would call up Casey and say, Bill, I need some help. And in the cabinet meeting, when it looked like the vote was going against me, Casey would speak up, and every time he spoke up, I won. Matter of fact, I kept score, and on 20 of these different confrontations with Nitzy and myself, I won 18 times, and Nitzy twice, all due to, or most of it due to Casey. Another thing I remember about Casey was during the, we told him that this statement, "Dovere no provere," you know, he would say, "Well, I can get that," and he learned it pretty well. He said, "You mean the deal with cut the cars, don't you?" And he said, "Yes, that's what I mean. Verification." He absolutely believed in verification and equality, and we could never quite convince all the people of the State Department and the Arms Control Agency on those points. But Casey was right there in that same corner of saying that, you know, we have to have equality and we have to have verification. In the second term, President Reagan decided to send me behind the Iron Curtain to brief the members of the Warsaw Pact. The way that came about was right after our first big summit in Geneva. We were sitting around having a post-mortem on what happened, and President Reagan said, "Nitze, what are you going to do?" And Nitze said, "Well, I'm going to go debrief NATO." And he said, "Rowney, what are you going to do?" I said, "Well, you know, you usually send me over to China and Japan." And he said, "Well," he said, "why don't you go behind the Iron Curtain?" He said, "You think you can go behind the Iron Curtain and tell them what we're doing?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And Schultz said, "Oh, that's a dumb idea, Mr. President. It'll never work." He said, "Well, Rowney said it will work." He said, "Call up and see if what they say." So I called up a good friend of mine who was the ambassador to Czechoslovakia, because that's where the Warsaw Pact was at the time. And he said, "Sure, come ahead." So I went in and briefed them, and then I went over and briefed Poland, Jaruzelski, and briefed Havel and the others. And then I got a call from Casey. He said, "Why don't you go over and brief the Pope?" And I said, "Well, yes, if you tell me to." And he said, "Yes." Well, I was delighted because it gave me an opportunity to see the Pope, whom I'd known before when he was a bishop. And I said, "What are my instructions? What do I say?" He said, "You don't have any instructions. I don't care what you tell him." He said, "I'm not worried about what you tell him. What I want to know is what he tells you." He said, "You're absolutely compartmentalized." He said, "I know you know Dick Walters, and I'm sending Dick Walters over on the technical side, but I want you to just talk in generalities and find out what the Pope said." Well, I did that, and it worked like a charm. I say that to this day, until Dick Walters died, I never knew what Walters said to the Pope or the Pope said to him. But I do know that Casey and the President were very interested in what the Pope said, and want to know what the Pope was also interested in what Jaruzelski said to me and Havel. And at one point, I remember when both Reagan was shot and the Pope was shot, and it was interesting that the Pope said to me, "I really admire Reagan's sense of humor." He said, "Here he is lying with a bullet near his heart, and he's asking these people, 'Look, are you doctors all Republicans?'" He said, "What a sense of humor." And I said, "Yes, Your Holiness." "You know what he said about you?" He said, "What?" I said, Reagan said to me, he said, "I just don't understand how a man can forgive somebody that's shot and try to kill him." He said, "That man must be a saint." So, no, those were just a few things I remember about this Reagan and peace through strength. But Casey was a real powerhouse in that, and had this great faith in Reagan, and vice versa. Reagan backed him to the hilt.
Thank you. Bill Casey used to love to tell the story that one time when he was doing some briefing in Rome, he was asked a question, and he had some aerials with him, and he said, "No, these aerials don't show that, but we'll adjust the orbit so tomorrow they will. And the fellow said, you can change the orbit of the satellite? Yes, Your Holiness. Okay. John, do you want to add to that?
Okay, thank you, Owen. I would like to build on everybody's remarks, to which I very firmly subscribe, and particularly Peter Schweitzer's remarks about how important it was that the Reagan administration was devoted to taking advantage of strategic opportunities and vulnerabilities in the Soviet Union. From my perspective as a Sovietologist in those days, one thing that was really very clear to me was that the central fact of political life in the Soviet Union was the Soviet regime's fear of its own people. This was an illegitimate regime that had not been elected by anybody. The consent of the governed was not present. And when the first Constituent Assembly elections took place immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution, the people who came to assume that, first of all, the Bolsheviks lost the election to a non-communist socialist party, and when the delegates came to assume their positions in the Constituent Assembly, they were shot. And so the Soviet regime had a big internal security problem, and the various measures by which they exercised totalitarian control over their own people were simply the measure of that internal security problem. Complete control of all communications, all press, all film, all of the educational system, of the economy, of job placement, of internal travel, of housing, control of the borders, neighborhood block committees, the Gulag Archipelago, umpteen different intelligence snitches in each military unit, all spying upon each other, just to make sure that there was no opportunity for internal resistance developing in any cells, in any corner of the Soviet system. The KGB would penetrate sports clubs, historical societies, and everything else that they could possibly penetrate in order to maintain internal security. The importance of internal security was bolstered by Soviet foreign policy. This was explained to me in spades once by a Soviet dissident, the great Vladimir Bukovsky, who spent a third of his life in the Gulag and was then exchanged for the chairman of the Chilean Communist Party and was received by President Carter in the White House. Bukovsky explained that Soviet foreign policy was designed to serve the internal security system of the state by constantly expanding. The message that the Soviets were sending to their own people through their foreign policy was this, as Bukovsky described it. Attention, people of the Soviet Union and of the larger Soviet Empire, we, the Communist Party, can shoot down civilian Korean airliners, we can invade Afghanistan, and we can send arms to the Nicaraguan communists right under the nose of Uncle Sam, and not even the greatest imperialist power in the world can resist us. So if the imperialists cannot resist us, how can you people behind the Iron Curtain, behind the barbed wire and the razor wire and the 200,000 KGB border guards and their snarling dogs, how can you contemplate resisting us? Resistance is futile. Now, the strategic problem here was that the Soviets were vulnerable. They were afraid of their own people. They were afraid of democratic ideas, an alternative concept of legitimacy. They were afraid of the truth, which is why they ruled with lies, their constant propaganda. And so when Joe Detrani talks about how powerful the truth was, that was probably the single most powerful weapon that we had. It was manifested by President Reagan himself in his moral witness, where he would tell the actual truth about the nature of this regime, what it did to its own people, how it behaved abroad. And then we broadcast this truth over the Voice of America, over Radio Free Europe, over Radio Liberty. And by the way, for those of you who don't know it, RFE and RL were both some of the most imaginative creations of the Central Intelligence Agency back in those early days when the CIA was given more free rein to conduct political action. But those radios, the RFE, RL, were each of which were broadcasting in some 15 and 16 languages, one to the Soviet Union, the other to different countries in East Europe, were a domestic surrogate free press for those countries. And then we were sending in the mimeograph machines and sending in the fax machines and all sorts of other technology, and paper, because the party had a monopoly of paper. And all of this had to be done covertly. It was done with great imagination and skill by the agency under Bill's leadership. And so we were telling the truth as a huge part of this. But you know, the problem here was to take advantage or to try to get the peoples of the Soviet Empire to be emboldened to resist, rather than to descend into the mire of that psychological sense of futile resignation, which the party wanted to keep them in, so that they would suppress their internal security, and this is where the Reagan doctrine came in that Peter was talking about, where if Nicaraguan campesinos could overthrow a communist government in Managua, then it might be possible that resistance was indeed not futile. And what's so interesting about this was that the Solidarity movement understood this very well. The Solidarity movement, unbeknownst to lots of people, was stealing arms from Soviet munitions depots and was putting them on ships in the Polish port of Gdynia and sending them to Nicaragua, to the Nicaraguan anti-communist resistance, under the theory that freedom in Warsaw would not happen until there was freedom in Managua. Extraordinary. Well, there were all sorts of other simultaneous crises going on within the Soviet Union. We've talked about the role of taking advantage and this is where Bill was hugely influential in exploiting Soviet economic vulnerabilities. The Soviet economy started its crisis in 1917. That's when the great annual drought started. So the crisis of the consumer economy was nothing new. What was new was the crisis in the military economy and the inability of the Soviet Union to compete with American technological developments, the digital revolution, computerization of guidance systems and all those sorts of things, stealth technology, SDI. All of these things demonstrated a technological sprint capability on the part of the United States that the Soviets simply couldn't compete with. And they were between a rock and a hard place. They either had to reform internally so that they could start creating some of their own innovations to compete with ours, or they had to be dependent upon us. Gorbachev, there was a lot of talk about internal reform in the Soviet system, but they ultimately did very little actual reform. Lots of Sturm and Drang, very little action. As a matter of fact, you could even argue that Khrushchev did more decentralization of economic decision-making during his years in power than Gorbachev did, for all of the propaganda that came out of the Gorbachev Kremlin. But The crisis was in this military economy. They couldn't really reform, so they needed the economic bailout, which is what Joe talked about. They were even going to China looking for money. They were trying to get it out of Germany. They were trying to get it out of us. One of the reasons Gorbachev was picked was because he was a good PR man who didn't look like one of those old, middle of the 20th century thugs with the ill-fitting suit. He looked, he looked like a good PR man, and he was. Remember when he came down Connecticut Avenue just a few blocks from here, and he jumped out of his car and he started to glad-handing on the passers-by at the corner of Connecticut and L, and they were all swooning with delight that they had just met, the second coming. And he was very, very skillful at doing this stuff, and they had a massive cultural offensive, a charm offensive that was done in this country, precisely to show that we were not, that they were not a threat to us anymore. There was a very specific strategy which was articulated by several Soviet Soviet officials. We will deprive you of the enemy image. And once that enemy image has evaporated, the entire American military presence in the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and the Mediterranean will collapse like a house of cards. Their whole deal was psychological disarmament of the United States, and they were so desperate to try to get the military economic pressure off their military-industrial complex. Bill Casey exploited this by working with the Saudis to try to expand their oil production in a huge way, thereby lowering global oil prices. And the only hard currency the Soviets were ever earning came from the sale of arms, gold, energy, and maybe something else: oil, gas, arms, and gold. Anyway, we deprived them of hard currency doing this sort of thing. There were all sorts of other things that were done. We struggled to prevent one of the Yamal pipeline from coming into Europe, where they could make the Europeans, the gas pipeline, making the Europeans hugely dependent upon Soviet gas, when the Soviets were notorious for engaging in embargoes for political pressure reasons, and so on and so forth. One of the things that Bill did when he was at CIA, in addition to helping supervise some of the different covert actions to exploit these things, was he did various studies, intelligence studies, on Soviet vulnerabilities of their economy, vulnerabilities with regard to civil unrest and disaffection within the community. One of the favorite studies I saw coming out of there was published by a distinguished CIA analyst who was on civil unrest within the Soviet Union, riots, strikes, demonstrations, all sorts of things that few of us were aware of any of these things, and yet the agency had uncovered them, and it had given a huge huge insight into the internal vulnerabilities that this system had that could be exploited by such things as telling the truth. Ultimately, there was the fact that the president was able to bear moral witness and show, by the way, to the peoples of the Soviet Empire that we had the courage to tell the truth, whereas so many of the president's predecessors had censored themselves about the nature of the Soviet system, and that we were able to stand by them, connect with the peoples of the Soviet Empire, and give them hope. I mean, combined with all these material pressures, when these people started taking to the streets, and they didn't take to the streets for more pay or more vacation time or for OSHA to come and make sure they had clean floors in the workplace. They went to the streets because they wanted radical political reform. And it was this integrated strategy of putting the whole thing together, so much of which was enabled by vulnerabilities analysis done at CIA under Bill's leadership that made all of this possible. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Now, during this period, Henry Now was the Director of International Economic Affairs at the NSC. You were the Soviet desk, and Henry was the International Economic Desk, which was vital to this whole program.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you very much. I'm sort of an unplanned part of this program. And so maybe as an unplanned part of the program on the last panel, late in the afternoon, as the last speaker, I should be brief. But I'm very pleased and thankful to be included, and want to thank my colleagues, John in particular, but also my former student, Peter, who so kindly acknowledged that status. That's a secret weapon of professors, you know, former students. And sometimes they actually go on to outgun us. And in many ways, Peter has. He's written just wonderful material. I myself am exactly, which I have drawn upon heavily in some of the work that I've done on Reagan, not as intensively as Peter has. And so I want to commend this program and this moment, this day of celebration of Bill Casey, and maybe just express the wish that in the future, think about maybe doing this on a college campus.
Sure.
Because that way we could keep alive the legacy of, you know,
We happen to have
Bill
a close
Casey.
affiliation, the Caseys do, and obviously Peter closer, with the Reagan Ranch and with the Young Americans Foundation.
Terrific.
And
Well, you know,
I,
I'm
for
gonna-
one, am willing to go to any college campus that I'm invited to.
That's terrific. Oh, and no, I realize that. I'm actually just, I'm inviting myself, or I'm inviting you to George Washington University.
Great.
Where, you know, it's so important for the young people to hear this and to know about this history. I didn't know Bill Casey that well. I simply observed him in quite a number of cabinet meetings, and I would see him from time to time roaming the halls of the old executive office building. He was a life force. I heard that from my colleagues. They would say that, you know, if he visited you, you better be on your toes. He was hands-on. I mean, extraordinary, really. He was hands-on, and you just better know your brief when he walked through your door. I worked on the economic side of the strategy, of Reagan's strategy. That is, mostly on the free market side. I had wonderful colleagues like John and Norman Bailey and Roger Robinson, Joe DeTraney out at the agency, who worked on the Soviet side, on the Soviet economy side of the picture, and who did terrific work in terms of putting these pressures on the Soviet Union and exploiting its vulnerabilities. I was concerned with Ronald Reagan's economic program for the United States and for the free world. And as Peter, absolutely essential point that Peter made about, and John reinforced it, about the strategy of Reagan. There were really four parts to it. He was determined, of course, to balance power with the Soviet Union. That was important. That was the role of his defense buildup. He was determined to negotiate with the Soviet Union. We forget that, but in fact he was from the very beginning. He wrote letters to Brezhnev already in 1981 saying, look, I think we can talk about some of these things and we can get something done. That was the second part of his program. The third part was to apply this pressure to the Soviet domestic regime, which he did not regard as legitimate, which was not legitimate, and it was the new element, really, of his Soviet policy. It was the new element of NSDD 75 that said, look, we're going to actually change the character of this regime. We're going to do everything we can, everything within our power, to change the character of this internal regime. So bring pressure on that domestic structure inside the Soviet Union. And then the fourth part of the program, which was equally important, was to revive the U.S. and the Western world economy. Had we not done that, then we might have been in as bad shape as the Soviet Union. You have to remember what the 1970s were like. we were in a serious economic crisis in the 1970s. In many ways, by the way, worse than the one we've just been through, which gets characterized as the Great Recession, when in fact the difficulties in the 1970s were far worse. We had higher inflation, we had higher unemployment, and so Ronald Reagan knew that he had to turn that situation around. And his first year in office, he put out the word that he was not uninterested in foreign policy. We all knew that anyway. He said, but don't let foreign policy interfere with my domestic program. I've got to get this economy and I've got to get this defense build-up underway before I can do anything that I want to do in the foreign policy field. And so that was his commitment. It took a while. It took 2.5 years to bring the economy back. And I will tell just one short story about the nature of Ronald Reagan, and I think indirectly also the nature of Bill Casey and men like Ed Meese and Bill Clark, who I also worked for, the strong character of these people. We went in to see President Reagan in November of 1982. I was there to report on the GATT meeting, which was a meeting of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which we used to be the International Trade Organization, and I had just been to a ministerial meeting to try to launch a new round of trade negotiations, part of Reagan's program to open up the world economy. It had not gone well. Obviously, we were in the middle of a bad recession. Everybody was mad at us. Europe was yelling at us for the highest interest rate since Jesus Christ, and so on and so on. So the economic situation didn't look very good in November of 1982. That was the beginning of sort of that crucial year of deploying INF missiles in Europe, where, of course, protests were beginning to escalate, street protests against the deployment of those missiles. So things looked pretty bleak in November of 1982. And we went in, and I gave my little spiel about the GATT ministerial and why it didn't work and what we should do about it. And at the end of the session, Bill Clark said to the president, Mr. President, we've got these difficulties now with, the world economy, with the Soviet situation. What do you think we should be doing about this? Should we be thinking about a plan B? And President Reagan sort of looked at Bill Clark for a moment, kind of rocked back and looked up to the ceiling. He says, no, Bill. He said, I don't think so. He says, I think things are going to move along okay. He says, I think the Soviets are going to, eventually come around, and this economy is going to do all right. We'll get there. And my boss, Bill Clark, who knew President Reagan very well, along with Ed Meese and a few others, were about the only ones who could say this to the president. He said, well, Mr. President, if you're so smart, tell me, how's that going to happen? And Reagan, of course, just laughed. And he said, well, you know what, Bill, even if it doesn't happen, he said, what's the worst that can happen to you and me? And Clark sort of looked at him, and Reagan said, we go back to the ranch. How bad is that? This was an extraordinary moment for me, at least. I thought to myself, look at the strength of this man. He knew what he was going to do. He knew what he was in the process of doing. He was going to let it take effect. And if by some, plan of God it didn't work, he was more than happy to go back to the ranch and to be the person that he was. Well, Ronald Reagan did turn that economy around. By the way, a big part of it was something that John just mentioned, and that is and it had a lot to do with Bill Casey, that is getting oil prices down. A dramatic drop in oil prices. You have to remember that in 1984, 1985. I guess it started in 1985, fall of 1985. I remember that because I sold my house right before that happened. And once oil prices dropped, of course, interest rate dropped and my house price went up. But unfortunately, I had already sold it. But that was critical. That really took the wind out of the sails of the Soviet economy. But even more importantly was the tremendous revival of the U.S. and the Western world economy that occurred. We have had 30 years of the most extraordinary growth, the steadiest growth in the U.S. economy and in the world economy than we have had in the history of this country. And that's often forgotten in light of the recent difficulties that we have been through. But this past 3 decades is really an extraordinary period, and it was the basis on which then the Western countries, the United States and the Western countries, were able to make effective those other 3 prongs of the strategy. That is, to keep the pressure on the Soviet domestic system because they couldn't match us. There was no way they were going to keep up with us once we got going. And secondly, to the other 2 pillars to both balance the power of the Soviet Union, that is, deploy those INF missiles, and then to negotiate, and bring the Soviet Union to the table. having blocked the other ways by which the Soviet Union could have achieved its objectives, meaning those ways outside the negotiations. Now the Soviets had to negotiate with you. And of course, we got deals in the latter part of Reagan's second term that were very, very favorable to the United States and to the Western countries. I will just say in closing again that I am just very grateful to the experience that I had in knowing people like Bill Casey, like President Reagan, and like Ed Meese. And I'm thinking to myself, Ed, I heard you speak just a month ago at the Heritage Foundation, and every time I hear you speak, I get recharged, I get regenerated, and I just hope we can keep you around here for a long, long time to come. Because it's a story that we have to keep telling over and over again. The legacy of men like Ronald Reagan and Bill Casey is something that we should really cherish and cultivate for a long time.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody here for sticking it out and staying with us. I know it's been a long day. To me, it's been a very inspiring day. And I want to thank all of the people who have participated as speakers and all of you who have been here as the audience. Immediately following, as you walk out of here, we're going to have a reception. I want all of you who don't know the Institute to at least come meet us. So we're going to have a reception at the Institute of World Politics, which is exactly one block. Half a block. It's half a block away. We're on P, and right now we're at 16th and P, and the Institute is 16th and Church, which is half a block away. So it's not, I guess it, what? Half a block north. North. And I guess you'd say that means it's about 6 buildings north from here. So it's not a long trip. For those people who have walkers and so on, we'll arrange for them to come in the back door. And I'll see you there in a couple minutes. Again, thank you very much.